This is an appeal for international help and intervention of the child system in Denmark. I make this appeal on behalf of thousands of protective parents and their children whom have been terrorized for years by the inhumane practice of Danish authorities in child cases. Human rights and the child conventions are violated on a daily basis by the Danish authorities, and the best interest of the child is ignored with prolonged and grave consequences for the children of Denmark. In Denmark, children and mothers are not protected against domestic violence and abuse. It is common practice not to believe a mother when she speaks up about the abuse and violence she and her children have endured. Although the Directive to the Parental Responsibility Act from 2007 clearly states that the authorities must protect children and their mothers from abuse, battered mothers are dismissed and blamed for lying, being mentally diseased, and manipulative if they tell about the violence they have experienced from the father of the child. For years, the Minister of Children and Social Affairs has ignored numerous studies and international criticism of the practice of child cases in Denmark. In 2011, the Danish National Social Board published the results of a 4-year study on children and mothers in families with violence and abuse. The study reveals that the National State Administration, which is the administration deciding on visitation rights and temporary custody, does not work for the best interest of the child, and that the National State Administration allow the continuation of abuse, battering and incest of children. Despite this knowledge, the practice continued. In 2013, the Department of Trauma Psychology at University of Southern Denmark published a study demonstrating that the National State Administration does not work according to the best interest of the child. It further showed that a high percentage of battered mothers develop post-traumatic stress disorder because the National State Administration does not protect their children from abuse. Nonetheless, the practice continued. Again in 2013, the European Council visited Denmark to evaluate the highly critical practice in Denmark where protective parents lose their children to the abuser. The Council concluded that the practice of the Danish authorities violated the best interest of the child, and the Council wrote a highly critical report. Still, the practice continued. In 2014, a UN survey concluded that the Danish women were the most battered in Europe. Still, the practice continued. In 2015, the UN Women Council set out, criticized Denmark for violating mothers' rights to their children and asked that the kidnapped boy Oliver returned to his mother in Austria. Nothing happened. In 2017, the UN Fifth Annual Report on Denmark criticized Denmark because the Child Protective Services violates human rights and ignore and violate national law in cases of forcibly removing children from their parents. A random examination of the Child Protective Service in Copenhagen revealed violation of the national law in 100% of the cases. Nevertheless, the practice continued. Later in 2017, Grevio, which is the UN board overseeing that member states protect women and children, heavily criticized Denmark in several areas. Especially the national state administration received massive critique due to the obvious mishandling of cases where there have been abuse of mother and child. The Minister of Children and Social Affairs dismissed the report and the practice was allowed to continue. In 2018, the largest child help organization in Denmark published a report on neglect of children in Denmark. The report accentuates the illegal practice by the authorities and the violation of Article 12 in the Convention on the Right of the Child. Children report that they are not provided with the opportunity to be heard in judicial and administrative proceedings affecting the child, and if they are heard, their views bear no weight. Adding to this, a large number of independent human rights organizations criticize Denmark for violating children's human rights in cases where there have been abuse and violence against children and their mothers. In 2007, Denmark implemented a Parental Responsibility Act, which defined that equal right to both its biological parents was in the best interest of the child. The juridical committee included in its directive to the Act that the national state administration was obliged to protect abused children and mothers, but the national state administration developed the opposite practice and focused entirely on the part of the Act concerning the child's right to both its biological parents. To mainstream this practice, psychologists and caseworkers developed a method endorsing the child's right to both parents. The method entailed the consensus that the worst a child can experience is to be put in a loyalty conflict between its biological parents. Hence, the definition of good parenting skills became skills of collaboration and not skills of caring and protecting. Since 2007, the focus in child cases has therefore been on the parents and not on the thriving of the child. When skills of collaboration are those most necessary in order to show good parenting skills, the problem of evaluating abuse and violence dissolved. When mothers tell about abuse and violence, it is habitually ignored by the national state administration and child protective services. Psychologists, the police, and social workers consider allegations of abuse and violence to be false, and even despite children and mothers sought protection in women's shelters, and despite numerous hospitals and GP statements suggesting that the child and the mother have been abused, it's not taken serious. This is a serious neglect from the state because the latest statistical numbers show that every 11th child in Denmark experiences severe domestic violence and abuse. Because a mother doesn't show good skills of collaboration when she refuses to hand over her child to violence and sexual abuse, she is then accused of creating a loyalty crisis within the child and not being able to protect the child from herself. This even despite the child tells caseworkers, psychologists and social workers about the abuse. Most cases reflect that the more insisting the child and mother becomes in protecting themselves, the less they are believed and the more sympathy is developed for the abusive and violent father. Mothers are continuously pressured to collaborate, and yearly thousands of mothers are forced by caseworkers to collaborate with a man who has beaten her, abused her and her children. Otherwise, the authorities will remove and take away her children. When a mother psychologically and emotionally reacts to the terror she is exposed to, she is then accused of being mentally diseased, which in turn then is the leading cause of why she finally loses her children to an abusive father. In Denmark, social workers in child protective services enjoy the liberty to personally conclude what is right and wrong and up and down in child cases. The social worker has the liberty to dismiss opinions and evaluations from external specialists, follow her own dislikes and likes, and ignore the national law. The latter because Danish authorities never question other Danish authorities, and therefore complaints of malpractice and abuse of power is never believed by the National Complaint Board or the courts. Hence, accusations of a mother being mentally diseased can be put forward as a truth without anybody asking for any documentation hereof. The general practice of the Parental Responsibility Act has conveniently stopped mothers from filing police reports when their children speak about abuse or when she herself experiences abuse and violence. If she files reports and seeks help from professionals in cases of sexual abuse, which by the way is almost impossible to get convicted for in Denmark, she is considered by caseworkers and psychologists working within the child system as being a troublemaker and making up stories of abuse and violence. When a mother expresses concern handing over her child to a father who has beaten her in front of the child, or because her child tells her about sexual abuse and even shows symptoms hereof, it is immediately turned upside down and the father becomes the victim of a mentally diseased mother, and the mother is accused of not showing adequate parenting skills. Because the mother tells the truth, she is not collaborating, and she is then held responsible for creating a crisis of loyalty conflict within the child. Or told in other words, when social workers, police, and a certain segment of psychologists evaluate what is best for the child, they consider violence, abuse, and pedophilia less damaging for the child than a crisis of loyalty. This is because the Parental Responsibility Act dictates that the child has the right to two parents. And parents who refuse to collaborate with the Danish authorities about damaging their child by handing them over to abusive parents are stigmatized, and often the protective parents will be forced by the social worker to participate in programs where she or he will learn to abide and collaborate with their abuser and the social worker. An appointed psychologist will earn between $7,000 to $20,000 to carry out a superficial evaluation of the parent and children. Psychologists within the child system do not have specialized training in abuse patterns and will just apply whatever knowledge they own to their own evaluation method. The psychologist will evaluate which parent collaborates the best and recommend the child live with that parent. Without any consideration to bonding, siblings of the child, and abuse, a psychologist can recommend the child go live with an abusive and violent parent only because the protective parent is in opposition to further damaging the child, and the parent show that she is in opposition to the authorities. This is abuse of power. Motherhood in Denmark is devaluated, and it is worth noting that when a child lives with the mother, the authorities are very keen to insist on the child's right to both its parents. After the child has been removed from the mother, suddenly the child doesn't have any rights to two parents, and the mother is almost definitely cut off from the child, leaving the child with no other option than comply. Children in Denmark quickly learn that their words have no value. From 2019, a new Parental Responsibility Act and a family courthouse will take over the duties from the national state administration. However, the staff and the practice will follow into the new system. The new act states that the family courthouse renounce any obligations to follow international conventions. The new act does not command staff in the Child Protective Services to abide the law, but instead give the social worker even more power. Danish authorities protect each other, and no one will question a social worker's decision, despite the social worker is not in any way educated to handle cases where there are abuse and violence. In Denmark, caseworkers who forcefully and without consent remove children from their parents don't need more than 1 year education, and that education does not entail any knowledge about child psychology, abuse or domestic violence. Although the new Parental Responsibility Act is an attempt to change the perspective for thousands of children experiencing abuse, thousands upon thousands of children still suffer or have died due to the practice I've just explained. It is paramount that cases which have been handled with the perspective that abuse, violence and pedophilia is less damaging than a loyalty crisis are being reopened and re-evaluated with focus on what is really in the best interest of the child as defined by the Child and Human Rights Conventions. And Denmark has to stop criminalizing and persecute mothers who speak up about violence and abuse. And Denmark has to stop imprisoning and punish mothers who protect their children from domestic violence and abuse. The Danish child system is a disaster, and it is adamant that international powers interfere, helping Danish children and their protective parents. We need and we ask for international interventions to seize the abuse of power, and we need and we ask for international interventions to seize the tragedy, the mishandling of child cases, persisting for more than 2 decades, has created. You can contact the Ministry of Children and Social Affairs on sm@sm.dk or the minister at min@sm.dk if you have any queries about the Danish child system, or if you want to hand in a statement.